Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome to our series on the 10 most important battles of the Civil War. We've completed the 10 most important battles of the Civil War. In the previous episode, we looked at the conclusion of the Overland Campaign and the formal terms of surrender of the Confederacy at Appomattox Courthouse. We are by no means ready to wrap up the series. Much like the theatrical and extended version of Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, there is going to be a very long epilogue here because there's so much to cover with the Civil War. This episode isn't so much an epilogue, but it's looking at an issue that we didn't really tie into the rest of the series, and that is the naval war that is occurring in the background of the Civil War. Now, this is nothing new with warfare of a naval battle being fought at the same time as an infantry battle or a land battle. You can look at the Napoleonic Wars.
Take a drink.
Yes, there we are. We forgot drinking in this series with when I mentioned Napoleon, when James mentions movies. Is there another thing you drink too?
We said something, but I can't remember what it was like a few episodes ago.
Yeah, I'm sorry, everyone. I haven't really brought in Napoleon. We mentioned Glory in a few movies the last few episodes. I promise I'll mention Napoleon more when we look at the epilogue. But
you're falling down the jaws.
Yeah, the War of Spanish Succession, which dumps all sorts of pirates into the Caribbean. That's the naval and land battles happening at the same time. So the Civil War is, of course, no exception, but there's interesting things happening with the Civil War because new technology is emerging that's going to forever change how naval war is fought. And there are also questions of strategy. Is it more important to just have good coastal fortifications, or do you want to control the high seas itself for naval supremacy? So these are questions that are taking place at the Civil War. But let's just start off. So, James, what's the background of the naval war in the Civil War?
All right. At the start of the war, the U.S. Navy was very small. It only had about 90 ships. But to make it even more interesting, only about 42 of those were in U.S. ports. The others were off in different parts of the world. And of those that were in U.S. ports, not even all of them were serviceable. So the Navy is just absolutely tiny, tiny, tiny. But despite this, the U.S. had great shipbuilding capacity. The Union had converted merchant ships into naval ships, or they began doing this very quickly, and they were really, really good at this, arming these merchant ships and turning them into combat vessels. So by the end of 1864, just taking a broad sweep here, the U.S. Navy had 671 ships in commission, so a more than tenfold increase. Over 200 were steamships and 70 were ironclads. We'll talk a little bit more about ironclads later. Very, very important. By the end of the war, the U.S. Navy was the largest navy in the whole world, even larger than the Royal Navy of Britain. They had 65,000 sailors. Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, under Lincoln, reorganized the Navy and made it much more efficient. He was a terrific administrator. He also looked a lot like the mythical figure of Neptune. He had this big, long, white beard. Lincoln actually called him Father Neptune.
He carried around a trident as well, which really completed the look.
Yeah, the trident. Yeah, I don't know if he had the trident, but he should have if he didn't. Here's a movie. I'll throw in a movie quote. Ding. We should have rung a bell every time one of us said it. But in the movie Lincoln, we actually see Lincoln calling him Father Neptune. It's really cool. All right, so the Navy, the Union Navy, or the U.S. Navy, which is now the Union Navy, they have a threefold goal. First of all, they need to blockade the southern coast. Okay, so keep supply ships from other nations getting in and keeps Confederate ships from getting out to take cotton and other goods to trade with other countries. Number two, they need to capture key Confederate ports, which of course will make importing things and make trade impossible if you don't have any ports, or almost impossible. And then number three, they needed to support the ground war using the rivers. Now let's go to the other side and look at the Confederate Navy. The Confederate Navy at the beginning of the war did not even exist. There was no Navy at all. Only 237 Union naval officers resigned to join the Confederacy. Very, very few compared to the number that stayed loyal. The South had no shipyards, no machine shops that could build steam engines big enough to power a ship. So an incredible disadvantage for the South, even more so than with the Army. And the South only had three naval yards, excuse me, New Orleans, Pensacola, and Norfolk. And at Norfolk, though, I do have to say that the Confederates captured 2,000 heavy guns. That's a pretty good haul there. And they captured a ship called the USS Merrimac, which they're going to rename the Virginia, and it's going to have a big future, which we'll talk about a little bit later. By 1862, the Union had recaptured all of the naval yards. So, advantage Union big time. During the war, the Confederates converted or built 130 ships, including 37 ironclads, and some of the latter had rams. Their job was literally just to crash into another ship and poke a big hole in it. So that's pretty good, 130 ships, considering they had no shipbuilding capacity, no shipyards, and only three naval yards that they didn't have for very long. The Confederate Navy tried to compensate for its numerical inferiority by technology. They came up with a number of innovations, or if they didn't invent them, they improved them. First of all, you had torpedoes, and torpedoes are not what we think of as torpedoes today. When you think of a torpedo, you think of a missile almost that floats through the water and goes far away and blows up the ship. A torpedo back in the time of the Civil War was just a mine. That's what we would call it today. So it's just a floating bomb, essentially. And these torpedoes or mines, by the end of the war, would sink or destroy 49 Union ships. That's pretty good. They also came up with torpedo boats. These are boats that had a big long projection at the end, kind of like a beak almost, and they would carry a mine on the end, and they would sail up next to a Union ship and then detonate the mine, and it would blow up. Of course, it would blow up the Confederate ship too, but it would be unmanned at that point, and it would blow up the Union ship. And then another thing the Confederacy did, which I think is really interesting, is they invented the very first successful submarine in history.
That's right.
Now, some people might say, well, okay, you had the Turtle in the Revolutionary War, and maybe there are other examples, but they weren't particularly successful. This was an actual submarine that had a crew that floated under the water and actually did damage to a Union ship. But it was very costly for the Confederacy to develop this ship. It was called the Hunley, by the way. They had two volunteer crews that drowned. So the first volunteer crew drowned, the second one drowned, the third one actually went out, and on February 16th, 1864, it attacked a Union blockade ship with a torpedo or a mine, and they sank the ship, but then the ship itself sank, and we don't even know exactly what happened to the Hunley that time, but so it was very costly just to blow up this one ship. It cost several dozen men. And then they also came up with commerce rating, and we'll talk about commerce rating. Of course, commerce rating wasn't a new thing. It had been around since the dawn of time, but they took it to a new art. We'll talk about that later.
And I think the most critical thing of the naval conflict is the blockade. It's not sexy just to talk about an economic blockade, but when we've looked at other campaigns in the series, the Siege of Vicksburg, the reason Vicksburg is so important is because Confederate logistics are being squeezed into a few very narrow points of entry. You have Texas and then Mexico on one side because you can't bring equipment through the seas. So this is overall crucial to military strategy. So could you describe the blockade a little bit?
Sure. The blockade was proclaimed by Lincoln at the very beginning of the war in April 1861. But at that time, the Union Navy had far too few ships to effectively blockade the southern coast. It was the most porous blockade in history. Huge holes in it. But as the number of ships increased, so did the effectiveness of the blockade. Obviously, the more ships you have to enforce the blockade, the more likely it is they're going to intercept any vessel trying to get in or out. Interestingly enough, I just want to mention one thing in passing. This proclamation of the blockade had interesting international ramifications, because think about what was the Confederacy to Lincoln? Well, the Confederacy claimed to be a sovereign nation, a separate country, right? But to Lincoln never admitted that the states had actually left the Union. phrasing of it was that the Confederate States had been taken over by a bunch of rebels who had then attempted to leave the Union, but they really didn't. And so the thing is in Lincoln's eyes, and what Lincoln said to everybody is the Confederacy is still part of the U.S. It's just a revolt or a rebellion. It's not like we're fighting another country, like fighting England or France or something. But then he proclaims this blockade. Well, the thing about a blockade is it doesn't make sense to blockade your own country, right? So just by declaring a blockade of the Confederacy, Lincoln is almost de facto granting them recognition as a sovereign nation. That's kind of interesting? And so that had ramifications overseas. The English, especially the British, who used to trade with the Confederacy a lot, they really relied on Southern cotton. The Confederacy cried foul when Lincoln proclaimed the blockade, and they said, well, you can't have, that's not a legal blockade, because according to international law at the time, for a blockade to be valid, it had to be effective. And Lincoln's blockade was very, very ineffective at the beginning. And so they said, this is just a blockade on paper. It's just a nominal blockade. It's not a true blockade. So it's therefore invalid, and we're going to ignore it. But eventually diplomacy prevailed, and Lincoln prevailed upon the British government not to have formal trading relations with the South, although certainly a lot of individuals traded as well. Anyway, it's just kind of an interesting thing there.
And one very short thing I want to mention is this ripples throughout the global economy. So in southern Turkey, the price of cotton explodes due to the blockade on the South, and there's all sorts of economic development that happens there. One of my friends wrote a dissertation on this whole economic development because of the Civil War. So global markets, you're getting to a point in history where we can see the seeds of a global economy taking root.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so anyway, the first Confederate blockade runner was captured in May of 1861. These are ships that are designed to be fast. They're usually pretty small. Their job is to just get through go as fast as you can and outrun the Union blockade ships. They don't have a lot of arms and guns. Some of them don't have any. By the end of 1864, though, there were 500 Union ships in the blockade. So it gets harder and harder for Confederate ships to get through the blockade. Now, the Union blockading ships were originally based at Hampton Roads, Virginia, and Key West, Florida. But those are somewhat removed from the coast, especially Key West, and it's too far away from many southern ports. As a result, the Navy decided to seize key inlets. And so by the end of 1861, Union forces had captured Hatteras Inlet, which is off the coast of North Carolina, Ship Island, which is off the coast of Mississippi near Biloxi, and then Port Royal, South Carolina. And this gave the Union a great supply depot and coaling station. All these did. Hatteras Inlet especially. But so they were able to have these bases kind of scattered throughout the area of the blockade, the Atlantic coast as well as the Gulf Coast. The Union soon extended its control over the other southern Atlantic coast down to St. Augustine, Florida, and up to Roanoke, North Carolina. So slowly but surely, the blockade spreads and becomes more and more effective. And we'll talk about its effectiveness a little later, but I want to take a little bit of a side note here. Well, actually, I need to take two. I forgot to do this at the beginning, but I want to, first of all, acknowledge that I'm relying very, very heavily on the notes here. I'm relying on Professor Gary Gallagher. He is a professor of history and one of the leading Civil War scholars of our nation. He is at UVA, University of Virginia, and he has several courses in the Great Courses series put out by the Teaching Company, which I highly recommend. And in particular, I'm referring to his course called The American Civil War. It's 48 lectures, so he really goes in depth. Scott and I, believe it or not, some of y'all are thinking this thing has gone on forever.
You have no idea.
Yeah, we are just, all we've talked about is battles and occasionally politics or other things, but he goes into everything. What was it like to be a woman in the North, a woman in the South? What's it like to be a free African American in the North? What's it like to be a farmer? He really, it's almost an exhaustive course, and I highly recommend it. If you like what Scott and I are doing, you'll really love that. So I don't mean to put a commercial in, Scott, but but I know Scott.
I've been known to do that in the past, so I'll accept it.
Yeah, Scott and I